Hello biology students, and welcome to video 1, which is going to be all about the respiratory system. So the first question we think of as we start a new body system is, well, what's the purpose of the system? What's the function of the respiratory system? And you might be able to figure out from some earlier units of the year that the purpose of the respiratory system is to exchange oxygen, bring it into the body, and expel CO2 from the body. We already know from earlier in the year that cell respiration, or energy metabolism, making ATP, requires oxygen to be our final electron acceptor, and it produces CO2 as that glucose is broken down. So we have to always constantly get more oxygen into our cells and get rid of carbon dioxide. So the respiratory system is needed to exchange gases between the organism and the environment. You can kind of think of gas exchange happening in 3 main steps. So the first step is that you're actually going to breathe. You're going to bring oxygen into the body and get rid of any excess CO2. The next step is your blood system, your circulatory system, has to bring those gases to all the cells in the body. So somehow that oxygen that entered the body is going to somehow get into the blood, so it can be brought to all of the cells in the body. And then once it gets to those cells, once it gets to those capillaries surrounding those cells, the oxygen then enters the cells, and that's step number 3. So you can see oxygen leaving the blood and entering the mitochondria in these cells for cell respiration, and the carbon dioxide, a product of cell respiration, leaves, to then be brought back to the blood and to be expelled by the lungs again. So it turns out that in most animals, it's required that the site of gas exchange be large and thin, because remember, the larger and the thinner it is, the more rapidly diffusion will happen. Remember those factors that increase the rate of diffusion? And it turns out that this respiratory surface, the place where gas exchange happens, also has to be moist. So it turns out, your lungs, where all this gas exchange is going to happen, the surface of your lungs are large, thin, and it's a moist surface. So I don't know about you, but you're thinking, well, what about plants? I mean, plants don't have, a moist surface where they can exchange gases. Remember, they're a little different. Remember that they have those holes in their leaves called stomata, where they could rapidly exchange gases. Okay, so in most mammals, or actually all mammals, all birds, all reptiles, and most amphibians, the organ where we get respiratory exchange or gaseous exchange is called the lungs. And the kind of the funny things about lungs is lungs are obviously restricted to one location in the body. I mean, they're only in your chest, or you don't have lungs in your feet. So therefore, really the main reason we have a circulatory system is because we have to be able to get the oxygen from our lungs to the rest of our body. So really the circulatory system and the respiratory system work closely together to transport these gases all around the body. And we aren't really going to talk about this, but some other more simplistic animals really have a very, very minimal respiratory system because they're so small they could just use their circulatory system to transport oxygen around the body. But we are more complex and need to have both systems. So basically, the bigger you are and the more complex you are, the more complex your lungs are going to be, because you need to have a more complex respiratory and circulatory system if you are more bigger and more complex. Okay, so here's a picture of the basic pieces of the human respiratory system. So the first piece is the nasal cavity, and again, the typing's a little weird here. But this is basically where the air is going to enter. Then we're going to go into the pharynx, the back of your throat, that same piece that we had in the digestive system. Only this time, instead of going down the esophagus, the air is going to go down this main tube called the trachea. That's this structure right here. Then you can see the trachea branches into smaller tubes. These smaller tubes are called bronchi, or singular is bronchus. Again, the typing is a little weird there. And then those bronchi branch into even smaller tubes called bronchioles. And then finally, they branch even smaller and smaller until we're small enough to get gas exchange. Another important organ in the respiratory system is the diaphragm right here. It's a muscle that kind of cuts across your chest, and we'll talk about that a lot more when we talk about breathing later in the unit. Okay, so let's walk through this system, walk through the pathway of air, and then we will call it a day for this video. So like we said, air is going to first enter your body via your nasal cavity. You're supposed to breathe in through your nose. And this is because in your nose there's lots of hairs, and these hairs help to filter the air. The hair catch any dust or things you don't want to be in your lungs. In your nose, the air is also warmed and humidified. So if the air wasn't warmed and humidified, if you've ever breathed in really, really cold air, it's very uncomfortable. So it's important that this air is brought up to body temperature and is brought up to body humidity. And also, I like this, the air is also sampled for odors. That sounds very fancy. So from there, the air is going to enter your pharynx, which is the back of your throat. And remember, your pharynx from here splits into the trachea and the esophagus. So at this point, air, food, and liquid are all traveling together, but the food and the liquid are going to go down your esophagus, where the air will go down your trachea. And remember that from the digestive unit, that flap of skin, the epiglottis, covers the trachea, covers the windpipe when you're swallowing food. So right below your pharynx, at kind of the top of your trachea, is this thing called the larynx. And the larynx is your voice box. So when you breathe air, when you're breathing air out of your trachea, that air crosses your larynx. It goes over your vocal cords. And those vibrations are actually what makes the sounds that allow us to speak. So far we have the nasal cavity, pharynx, and then larynx. And then finally the actual tube, your windpipe, is called the trachea. And this trachea, if I draw it here, it has a bunch of rings of cartilage that kind of look like C's. And that cartilage is hard, so it helps to keep the trachea open and prevents collapsing. And if you run your finger down the front of your throat, you can actually feel those C rings. They're hard. You can feel them right on your throat if you rub your throat. Okay. So after the trachea is going to branch into tubes called bronchi. So you have two bronchi, one that goes to your left lung and one that goes to your right lung. And then these bronchi branch into even smaller tubes called bronchioles. So you can kind of equate this to how arteries branch into arterioles. It's the same kind of thing. And then those smaller bronchioles branch into even smaller bronchioles until we get down to very, very, very small tubes. And as a side note, at this point, every structure we've mentioned so far has been lined by a moist layer. Remember, with gas exchange, everything has to be moist. And it's also lined with cilia and mucus. So remember, cilia are those little hair-like structures on the outside of cells. So if we look at this picture here, so these might be the cells on, the inside of a bronchiole, the inside of your trachea. And you can see all these cilia. And we talked about this earlier in the year, but the cilia actually beat, so they'll all be moving in this direction all together. And what that's going to do, it's going to beat any dust, up and out of your throat, so you don't end up with dust and things you don't want in your lungs. The mucus on all your respiratory tract serves a similar purpose. The mucus helps to trap dust particles, so again, they don't make their way into your lungs. So after the bronchioles, finally, so here's a little baby bronchiole, a tiny, tiny little tube. And at the very end of the bronchiole, it's going to end up dead-ending into these structures that look like grapes. And these grape-like structures are called alveoli. So alveoli are clusters of air sacs that kind of look like grapes. And these alveoli, that's actually where the gas exchange is going to happen. So you have tons of alveoli in your lungs. You have about 300 million alveoli in one lung, or in both lungs together, actually. And this is a surface area of 100 square meters. That's massive. It's 50 times bigger than the surface area of your skin. So you have tons of surface area where you get gas exchange happening. And these alveoli are covered with mucus, but not cilia. So again, we have the mucus because everything needs to be moist, but we don't want to have cilia at this point because if there were cilia, that would be space taken up by the cilia that we couldn't use for gas exchange. Okay, so here's a picture, so you can see at the end of one of these little bronchioles, if I blow it up, you can see these grape-like structures that are hollow, and that's where the gas exchange is going to happen. So oxygen is going to come in, and is going to end up being inside of these grape-like sacs, and then CO2 is going to come in from the outside and exit. Okay, so it turns out that the alveoli is just one layer thick. It's one layer of epithelial cells, and it's surrounded by capillaries. And this was the point, if I was doing this lecture live in class, I would say, well, why do you think it's surrounded by capillaries? And the answer for this is because capillaries is where the oxygen is going to enter into, and CO2 is going to leave the capillaries. So it's important that capillaries are surrounding all of the alveoli. So this really readily allows for gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. So the inhaled oxygen dissolves in that moist surface. So the reason that your whole respiratory tract has to be moist, because we need to allow the oxygen to dissolve in that water, and then it diffuses across the membrane, entering the bloodstream. And similarly, the CO2 diffuses into the moist environment and enters the alveoli. Okay, here's a picture of this. You can imagine that this is one grape over here on the inside of my lungs. So you can see the oxygen is going to dissolve in this moist fluid layer here. This blue is a fluid layer. And once it dissolves, it can enter the red blood cell in the capillary. This is a capillary surrounding the alveoli. And at the same time, the CO2 dissolves into that fluid layer and then enters the alveoli. It can go up and out the lung. Okay, so I like this picture because, first of all, the guy looks kind of funny, but also it shows you the whole system together. So you can see air enters the nasal cavity, through the pharynx, to the larynx, down the trachea, through the bronchi, through the bronchiole, and then if we jump over here to the blown-up version, it enters the alveoli and eventually enters the bloodstream. And it happens in reverse for carbon dioxide. So that's video 1. I will see you in video 2.